Hello and welcome back to a critique of Outlast. Can you believe it? We're already into part 3. How time does fly. Anyway, we were discussing the characters. Now, hang on. I have to show you guys something I found while editing part 2. There will be a main section for character animations, but my fucking god, look at this. If we put this sequence in slow motion, it'll give you an idea of the kind of corners they cut while making this game. Eddie Gluskin is slamming against the wall that you are on the other side of during Whistleblower and ultimately gets taken away. But if we slow this right down, you can see this random dude just chilling at the bottom of the stairs, waiting for nothing, and then suddenly, whoop, there he goes. Let's see that again. Whoop, and gotcha. Poor Eddie, he was clearly dealing with superheroes. Anyway, there are only really two significant characters left in terms of events in the main game itself, and first would be Billy Hope. Billy isn't given much screen time at all. What we know is that his mother was given money in exchange for his entry into the asylum, and the experiments conducted on him. After his lateral ascension, the Walrider, controlled by Billy, begins to slaughter each and every member of the asylum except for Billy's presumed father, Dr. Rudolph Wernicke. At the end of the game, you kill Billy by separating him from his life support, and there isn't anything else. That's it. You don't hear from Billy, you don't read anything written by Billy, you just kill the guy. After his potential years of torture, and yeah. Anyway, Rudolph Wernicke, a man who seems to be filled with several regrets about the life he chose as well as the abomination he helped create, is a troubled man, a troubled aged man who wants nothing more than to mend his own mistakes, and once you meet him in the game, he spills out the more complicated parts to how the Walrider managed to come about, and at the end of the game can only be assumed to be dead. The overall aspect I enjoy with the enemy characters in the game is that they are established visually and in documents before you meet them yourself. It's a solid standard foreshadowing, even though the profile showing up next to the enemy's areas is a little bit contrived. The characters in Outlast serve to add to the atmosphere more than anything. They are a selection of tortured souls telling us that there is immense pain and suffering in this world. They also serve to provide information and active antagonists in the game itself, as opposed to it being a more suspense and atmospheric ride through an abandoned asylum. There is a handful of people who speak as if completely normal in this game, even with the information that we're interested to hear, but they are broken husks of their former selves. They seem like they're absolutely sane and innocent people who have been brought here in and amongst the criminally insane.
They were waiting for us in this place. Billy understood. They've always been here.
That is very frightening as a concept, even down to having his genitals cut off, since we know there are fully functioning penises in this game, so the decision to take it away from a character model probably means the man from the DLC is visited, or perhaps it's part of the standard torture performed at the asylum. The thing I find the most is that the game lacks character, it lacks backstory, it lacks motivation. We get all the standards for almost all the enemies in the game. They do it because they're mad or crazy. These characters are established by a random profile written in a missable document, and this attitude towards them will inevitably result in them all blending together. The exception, of course, is Traeger. Traeger shows some real promise by being the mad doctor type with fantastic and unique voice acting combined with what is essentially his own level. He feels like a really worked out piece to the game that ends far too soon. They have no character that comes close in the main game to the work that went into Traeger. This results in the obvious feeling that these people are simply being dropped in front of you and hate you for no more reason than you are the main character. The world itself takes a hit thanks to this because you just happen to be the most unlucky person in this world to have to bump into all these people. How could they remedy this? To have made more characters, to have made them varied and developed, to have more Traegers, but obviously a hell of a lot more different Traegers. They overplayed the twins and Chris, even though they shoved a bunch of Randys in between them to try and appear as though they were making many different threats. They made a clear choice to underplay Traeger though. They gave him his own arena, his own voice, his development, reasoning for his position in the asylum itself, motivation, environmental storytelling, and yet he died just like any other human could. In short, the characters aside from Traeger and Outlast are extremely lacking to the point of distraction. And it is unfortunate since it combined heavily with a rather weak and vague story for an overall vehicle that serves to try and convince the player that these things might have happened if all these other things were real, while in reality it's just as contrived as any other terrible horror movie. Besides that, as I said previously about the priest being obsessed with you recording things, it's weird how he just doesn't give a shit if you don't do that at his last moment. The penultimate witness. You have the inconsistencies in the ability of the Walrider, being this inhuman spirit that decimates people almost simultaneously considering how fast it moves, yet when it comes to attacking the protagonist, he just becomes useless and slow. Hell, if you walk directly into him in certain areas, he just boops you. This is incredibly inconsistent. Why does this character just suddenly have no power? Also, just to top it off, you can actually just walk out of the speech Wernicke gives at the end of the game and you won't give a fuck. Like, I guess you should be able to walk out of it since it's player choice and everything, but there's no real world effect with all of this stuff. Characters just don't care, they all feel so bloody scripted. Which will be a thing on its own, I'm sure. The character models oftentimes don't react to you being there, they really feel like little movies that are playing whether or not you're there, and they'll make noise when you're in the vicinity.
They weren't experiments, they were rituals, a conjuring.
This can be explained away by them being insane, but let's be honest. It's just easy to set up, and has the very low-level effort of convincing the player there are several suffering people of all different backgrounds here, but despite that, upon a closer inspection, they are incredibly stative. Not to mention the limitations of the model really showing whenever they are shouting or complaining. Their limbs only seem to go in certain animations despite the fact that they really need to go in many. I mentioned the shoddy lip sync previously, but look at this example of a man who's going to move through a gate and then attack me. He's clearly in a standard animation of opening and closing the door, I would assume because they didn't want people being able to go up there, so he sort of is in the way the entire time. But the problem is, with that happening, he has to transition into the instantly running and attacking animation. Combine that with his epileptic mouth and the music cue running in, it's kind of distracting. But I'll be bringing this up again later. For now, the point is that it shatters all sense that these people are anything but scripted AI, not individual characters. Compared to something like the Flesher in Soma, where it is a fumbling patchwork of barnacles and flesh, this kind of inconsistent and bizarre behavior works just fine for this horrifying monster. But this is an actual man, he's just a little bit crazy. In closing, we were given the idea of an insane asylum with the goal of torturing patients accepted from many parts of the world in terms of background and development, with the sky as the limit for creativity in character and story, and we got this. They didn't capitalize on the chance to create so many interesting and terrifying characters, not yet including the DLC. We got Fleshy Hulk, Mad Butcher, and Ghost Faggot, all with a lack of background and catharsis compared to what could have been. Unfortunately, this was very much a waste, and the majority of the enemy characters are honestly all the bloody same. But is it good enough for the game that was being made? Well, we'll get into that as we progress. However, for now, I would say it depends on how high your standards are. Regardless, we must soldier on, and so that leads us to our next topic. So what do I mean by world? I mean stuff that essentially makes up what rules are in place, what behaviors and quirks are essentially normal and commonplace, and what we are told by the many aspects of the game about the player and the place we are in. There are aspects here from pieces of gameplay and parts of character that should make more sense as I progress. To give you an idea, is it not weird that we can find random cameras throughout the game that are broken? They aren't the same make as the camera we use in the game, nevertheless they just randomly show up. Or how about when we get to the point when we're close to Father Archambaud and his final scene, the church or chapel area. Everyone is praying, which raises plenty of questions, but once again we choose to accept these things as normal for lack of an interest in questioning why so many members of the insane asylum are happily subdued and praying to the bloody Walrider. Or the fact that there are loads of these coffee brand coffee mugs all over the asylum. Like, if you're going to be professional and not allow anything colourful or interesting, despite the drawings of course at the beginning, then why wouldn't you just have plain white mugs? Everything is so boring in this asylum. But the more distracting, like world-breaky stuff is when you hit stuff like invisible walls. Or just have an absolute rando that serves no purpose in the most secure areas of the asylum at the end of the game for no reason. But anyway, I like that you can honestly go as far as the tip of the vent and then make your way back to the opening gate at the beginning of the game. Though this level of freedom allows me to ask the question of why the fuck aren't we getting in the car and bursting through the gate with it? Like, seriously, you have enough evidence already, so what the fuck are you doing? Though, like, seriously, I actually tried to step out of that window in the first attempt at doing this, and the game literally shot me out of the window and threw me onto the ground and killed me. I honestly thought for a second that it was some kind of, like, you know, reference to maybe the Walrider kills anybody who tries to escape, and I thought for a second, oh, that would be really cool, and I was like, no, it's just the wonky-ass controls. We'll get to that. This gate that closes, by the way, seems to be activated by you looking at it from the opening. Like, as much as that's eerie, you could just still open it back up, surely. Not that there's an option for that. Outlast does try its darndest to world build, though. The documents are evidence of that. They try and establish that there were shades of grey all over the asylum, doctors and patients that were just as innocent and healthy as each other. The doctors put in complaints that budget was no longer being expended for the health of the patients, for example the lack of finger painting being made available for Martin Archambaud, which can be found right next to his big finger painting. Which... I really hate how all the relevant documents are found next to the events they will help describe. It's bloody distracting. But the small things matter too, like Traeger dropping his very threatening weapon down the side of the elevator to make sure we wouldn't have the chance to arm ourselves, since obviously all of us in real life would have taken that thing to actually help ourselves, you know, fight off additional enemies. But the thing is, there are other times we've had chances to arm ourselves, so it's not really that necessary. Also, being able to see parts of our own body as we traverse the asylum, like the legs, torso, and hands, is a really neat touch that I do actually appreciate. Makes you feel as though you're actually carrying around a whole body. Another point to make here about the world is that it's rather important that Outlast did not cheat where Resident Evil 7 did. During your time with Traeger, he cuts off your fingers, and it is a grand total of 2. One from each hand, which as you can imagine does not affect your ability to operate a camera or vault or climb over any sort of objects. I mean, as much as it would be painful, you can still do it. Resident Evil chopped off full sections of your body for the shock value and then immediately undid it, strictly because you actually need feet to be able to walk. Outlast managed to have some POV body horror without breaking the rules in which a protagonist in a walking simulator has to follow. So yes, creative and well within reason. Good job, Outlast. Anyway, moving on, every bloody person looks the exact same. There's this sequence near the beginning of the game where you find a whole bunch of heads and the very distracting centerpiece of the poor guy who is impaled ass to collarbone. But something didn't sit right with me about the heads. First of all, they seem unscathed. Like, imagine seeing 30 guys having their heads ripped off. You would expect flesh to be flying all over the bloody place. And this game has very few limits when it comes to that sort of thing, so what's happening here? Everything seems so clean, and we're to assume that this is the work of Chris Walker of all people. He is not known for his pinpoint finesse decapitation. Aside from that, though, they keep using this one guy's face over and over and over and over again. He just keeps appearing. Did you guys seriously not have that many models to use? I honestly couldn't believe this shit. I was just taking a quick glance at them, and I eventually saw that he's just here over and over. When you first approach the guys in the TV room in Outlast, you're already a little worried about the bald dudes in this world, but they are placid and non-violent, so you move through and wonder potentially that Chris might be your main and only issue. But then this guy grabs you, and you have to deal with the bald dude while trying to activate the generator, so this means you now have no clue who is friend or who is foe. You have to figure it out by the sound cues and the genuine moments of the enemies just giving you a strong boop. This is an issue that's regularly argued. It is clearly not applicable to the bosses, but what about the people, like, that fill the majority of the game? They seem to just randomly have issues with you and randomly not. We went over the dude earlier who probably best represents this, and there's another guy who represents it pretty well too, but we'll have to cover that briefly again in gameplay. But the point that is made on both sides here is, 1, the player does not know where they stand and therefore gets booted out of immersion when enemies just hit you and then run the fuck away from you, or you find some rando who's decided to start hitting you all of a sudden. The positive is that the player will always be on their toes, always wondering where they stand, and that can add to the tension and add to the immersion. I find that the reality is that you'll be confused in many parts because you don't always get music cues when this stuff happens, and so you're left spinning around looking for the damage source while wondering if you're in a chase sequence because the game's soundtrack is what dictates that to you. Like, you literally find what looks to be the merchant from Resident Evil 4 sort of Outlast style in a random part of the game, and what? Is he friendly? Hostile? Is he coherent? Will he come with us? Is he just a scripted movie playing behind an arbitrary block? Well, I guess so. The whole issue of understanding even a lick of what's going on in the heads of your enemies extends beautifully to the twins. The twins just decide they want nothing more than to kill and potentially eat you. For a game with such a lack of motivation for most things to begin with, it isn't hard to accept that. But as you will find moving forward, they are given a strong opportunity to find you, and they will simply ignore you for the most part. Sure, they'll complain that you've escaped them, but they'll make it clear that they know exactly where you are and yet make no attempt to catch you. They literally walk at about 1 step per second. It's laughably bad. Do they actually want to kill me? But it gets worse because they turn up again later, but now they don't say a thing. They don't even seem to recognize that I'm here. Do they still want me dead? Do they have an imagined grudge against me? I was so confused by their lack of dialogue that I figured they were just reusing assets, but it was literally the twins down to a T. They even have the exact same plan to kill you, and they do the whole instant kill thing. But moving forward, however, they eventually don't even want to attack you. They just decided that you're cool now, and that they will listen to Father Martin. I was so bloody thrown by them. People will argue that it keeps you on edge, but my issue was that I didn't believe the twins. They didn't really convince me they wanted me at all. Not like Traeger and Chris, they just seemed to not even realize I existed. And that might be tied to the AI, which we'll deal with. The problem extends further than that, by the way. This guy pretty much gets murdered, and then the guy who did it has this whole pokey army outie of the Dory thing going on. And he isn't the only one, but with both of them, you can walk right up to him and not take any damage or be treated the same way. They're just cutscenes being played with no actual relevance to the world itself, no effect. And this sort of inconsistent behavior in the world spreads strongly to the primary antagonist. I've covered this briefly, but we get to see a strong introduction to the mystery of the Walrider. He is ripping apart every member of the tactical team sent to clean up the incident. This group of soldiers, heavily armored and given powerful weaponry, are murdered very quickly, almost simultaneously, showing that the Walrider has something of an incredibly powerful set of abilities that allow him to potentially travel with extreme speed, possess great strength, and a rather large amount of intelligence. Hell, the Walrider ends up traveling extremely fast when it's spotted throughout the game. You can literally walk right into the Walrider during parts of the game and he'll hurt you, but that's it. He'll not kill you despite clearly getting bloody close. Like seriously, we're the only person in the entire asylum that stands a chance at killing Billy and taking the host from the Walrider, and it manages to just be a smoky wall that slowly approaches, similarly to the twins, funnily enough. You can literally sidestep this horrifying monster though. I don't understand why he won't kill me. Why don't you attack me right now? What is stopping him? I am the biggest threat that he'll ever come across, and I'm mostly that by accident. I'm not some kind of super being. This is bizarre. Billy will literally spawn in the wrong place. He'll attempt to chase you from the opposite place you need to be, like he's deliberately terrible at trying to kill you. Which would lend a pretty awesome storyline quirk if he wanted to encourage you to kill Billy because he couldn't do it himself or something, and he needed to be released from Billy so that he could be attached to someone else in a sort of host environment and then be taken out of the asylum. But there's nothing that supports that. I'm essentially doing what I was talking about earlier. I'm creating the story for the writers, which is just unacceptable. Besides, this theory isn't supported because the Walrider will literally kill you if he catches up to you. Rather easily, in fact, yet only when you play like a bloody snail. Also, what's the deal with the decontamination areas? He can't just deal with them, I assume? Too many questions about Billy. His whole position in this world is completely mystifying, which is unfortunate because everything else about the whole package of the Walrider works relatively well. There is this really compounding feeling in this game that is certainly being used to explain most if not every event, and that is the feeling that we really are the most unlucky bastard in the whole world. It very much feels as though we wanted to sort of just ignore the fact that we essentially end up visiting every last psycho all over the asylum, and you get to the point where you manage to evade or kill every single significant enemy in the whole game by the time you've done Whistleblower and the main game. All the while, you have several moments of the shittiest possible things happening, but I would rather put the focus on one particular person in relation to your incredible luck. Just how the fuck is Chris Walker always finding Miles? It begins with him giving you the old grab and throw, then the old door burst and chase, then the old glass burst, then the old chase and run, then you get the old sewer run, then the old sprinkler winkler, then the old garden hunt, then the old appear from nowhere gag, then the old great chase, then the old great chase again, and finally the old dead. This is ridiculous. Chris Walker just finds you all the time. He just keeps ending up in places that you're in at the exact same time. Don't even bother arguing that he's hunting you, considering that he is taking the time to kill everyone else along the way. He just happens to be where you are all the time, and of course he's finding different ways to get to where we're going, even though it always seems as though we've found the only way in. Of course, he does give up on you every once in a while. When you're dealing with other significant bad guys like Traeger, Chris just decides, you know what, it's not my time, I'll let them deal with him. Chris has his chain scraping sounds to signify that he is nearby, and it gets rather frustrating in that you'll be hearing it so bloody much. Many of the new areas you approach will be accompanied by the chain scraping, at first being commendable as a piece of sound design, but then not so much. It gets ruined by how much it's repeated. The really funny thing about this is that Chris will always find me, yet put very mild effort in keeping up with me. He will always find himself losing interest immediately if I move to another part of the world. This is strictly a result of his coding, but it can be so hilarious to compare that he will fall from the bloody sky to find you, but give up the second there's a tight squeeze and move on with his life. The most heinous example for me, though, is that he once again pops up in the courtyard during the all dark section, but once you travel across the whole courtyard via shimmying across the upper parts of the building itself, you come down, and who is ahead of you? Spawned for the effect of spooking you? Chris bloody Walker. I got so tired of this lumbering fuck's ability to teleport all around the game that I stopped seeing Chris Walker, the ex-military asylum patient, and started seeing Fleshy Block, the annoying NPC that's summoned whenever the game thinks that things are too quiet. There's such little effort being put into how he moves throughout the world, and such a blatant lack of interesting characters you could have aside from him, since you bump into Chris more so than you do random asylum people. Like, I don't make lightly of these sorts of criticisms. Let me show you very simply. These are 25 significant encounters in the main game. They are split into Traeger, Chris Walker, the twins, and Randy's, meaning people in the asylum who are essentially descriptionless. So let's color this up. Red is Chris Walker, Traeger is brown, twins are grey, and Randy's are yellow, with the Walrider being a nice pink. When you colorize the encounters in the game, you can actually see that Chris Walker stuffs this game with a staggering 12 separate encounters. And the Randys of the game only fill less than half of that. Why is Traeger so fondly looked at? Well, because he has one sequence. One crafted sequence with purpose directly in the middle. In fact, looking at this sequence, am I the only one who's spotting a clear pattern? They split Chris up into 4 main sections, cushioned him with the twins and Randy encounters, with Traeger punctuating the center of all of them. This feels very scripted when you look at it this way. But yes, this is a weird and terrifying world, as I'm sure you'd all agree. How about the fact that enemies cannot open doors once you've closed them, whether or not you actually locked it? Well, that's not fair. Traeger can open doors. Oh, and Eddie Gluskin, of course. And then you can open doors too, except when people close them suddenly. But wait, sometimes the normal dudes can open doors. I don't know, this whole thing is weird as fuck. Rules change based on whatever Red Barrels wanted. Also, did you guys notice the rules in place for lockers? The enemies will always check the one you aren't in unless they are the only locker, and then you're fucked. We now have the benefit of knowing that this game popularized the shit out of locker hiding, and it's kind of silly, but it worked for the small gimmick that it was, I guess. I don't know, this world is weird. With its boring coffee cups and, you know, burning feet in sinks, and the fact that you get the worst luck in the world. But before I close off, what in the fuck is with the whole fuses being placed on what sometimes appears as altars? What in the hell happened in this world? Why are people worshipping fuses? How come the exact amount of fuses I needed were in all of these, like, set out places, as if they were, like, waiting for me? How come they weren't used? How come they weren't broken? How come they weren't, you know, unavailable? Who took them and placed them here? This whole scenario plays out in such a gamey way. They should have given up completely at this point and just kept getting jump scares on screen and done away with the pretense of this actually being a, you know, game. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Overall, the world in Outlast is only believable for as long as you don't pay attention to it. When you spot all of the things that make it up, all of the things that, you know, just shouldn't be there and behave in ridiculous ways, it begins to shatter the entire experience. I do not feel that they really put a large amount of effort into the maintenance of a lot of the elements in Outlast. They sort of just made them all work if they were seen for a few seconds at a time, and hoped that people didn't really think about them for longer than that. I mean, fuck, did you guys notice how there's like only one kind of key to all of the locks in the game, and that fuses only work as a different skin for a key, and that's about it? Regardless, let's delve back into another point from Noah, as I think it's time to give him another chance to analyze this game alongside myself.
There is only one correct way to do anything in Outlast. One linear path to progress on.
Yes, I agree. As a result, the game is in the trial and error category. There's not a lot of room for making mistakes, as you can be locked into a corner for ending up in a dead end, but when you are more aware of the environment, defeating it becomes far easier. This is very much a classic analysis of a video game. When you have but one option, with a very meaningless change to the path throughout the game, it is undoubtedly linear. And adding the idea that you will die if you go down any other path, more than likely, because you didn't know about the events that transpire down those paths, it will naturally lead to it being trial and error.
People have characterized the gameplay as trial and error, but that's not quite it. Outlast is, at its core, still a movie. It has a deep script for navigation as well as narrative events.
I'm sorry, what? It isn't trial and error because it has a deep script for navigation? Noah, this game is not a movie. Are you trying to say the script has nuances to it that we're unaware of, or that it is indeed controlling the gameplay in a way that is far more intelligent than we realize? Because the game you are describing, and the linear trial and error horror game that I am describing, seem to have the same result on the surface, only you believe there is far more going on in terms of design?
If you can properly intuit what a scene you're in looks like in the game's hidden script, before you get disemboweled by a no-nosed giant, you get to progress. Out loud, this seems reductive to the point of inhibiting the quality of the game. Where's the fun in that kind of gameplay? By putting the player in the first person, by taking away the tools that would make the player think in a slower, tactical way, the game actually does succeed in creating the atmosphere it wants to. You're less of a player and more of a digital actor.
I recommend replaying that segment and really listening to what he says. Really try and understand his points, because I'm going to respond piece by piece here. First of all, how would you be able to intuit what the scripting is before being affected by it? He says that if you can, you'll progress first time. Whenever you make a correct turn or jump by chance, during, you know, getting rushed in Outlast, you are getting lucky. You're not intuiting the land since you couldn't know where the correct way is when leading up to it. So your premise is already faulty, but then we have part 2. You say out loud that it is reductive to the game and inhibits its quality, the aspect of having a player perform the correct motion without having the efficient knowledge to be able to do so first time. I don't know why you spent so much time and effort with synonyms that could only serve to misguide your audience, but what you are describing is the process of trial and error. And yes, it is inhibiting to the quality of the game. It always is. Then you said, by putting the player in the first person, by taking away the tools that would make the player think in a slower, tactical way, the game actually does succeed in creating the atmosphere it wants to. So first of all, they want a terrifying atmosphere. Nobody would counter that, and I am gonna go deep into that later, in, you know, probably like part 6. But let's agree that it is entirely subjective regardless. So to say that limiting the player's vision and response time while building on a trial and error system to add to the desired terrifying experience is literally just your opinion, since those aspects will ruin another person's sense of immersion and atmosphere. But you said the game actually does succeed in doing what it wants to do. I hate this line because in this argument the game is some entity that has a goal in this scenario. Let's make it easier and say the developers. Whether or not the developers did indeed get what they wanted in terms of atmosphere, this whole thing relies on the perspective of more than just your own experience to say this shit for sure. Not to mention that whether or not they got what they wanted doesn't dictate whether the design was good or not. Since I'm sure Goat Simulator and Five Nights at Freddy's are doing exactly what the developers intended despite being terrible games. Lastly, you said you are less of a player and more of a digital actor. What in the fuck does this mean? I can barely respond to this because it feels like a troll comment. Please drop this whole Outlast is a movie and you're an actor in it. If you want to have a discussion, let's talk about something like Ripper, Phantasmagoria, or Nightmare, where they were basically movies that had you push buttons in order to move things forward, rather than being a game that was essentially a successor to Amnesia with filters on it. These arguments are so paper thin, you keep using adjectives to describe stuff that's already established to remain vague without giving even your own personal definition. Properly intuit? Digital actor? Hidden script? This is taken from just 5 sentences alone. What do any of these phrases mean to you? Because they mean shit to the audience. It leaves them to have to skin what you're saying with meaning of their own, and thus your work and vision isn't even relevant anymore. You do that while also relabeling established mechanics and design flaws to fit a narrative that at the premise is difficult to swallow, but moving on to here I just have trouble taking it seriously at all. At this point we'll have to take another break from Noah, but there is still room for him to offer his perspective, and I will welcome it as we move forward. Alas, I am seeing a pattern in his writing already. And once again, folks, I am trying to be subdued in my responses, but you know me, I'm an asshole. So, next time we're going to be diving into the mechanics by opening with, well, what Outlast teaches players in terms of how to play. Join me then, folks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.